have invaded Russian territory in the Kursk region. And you have recently written a piece about this incredibly dangerous escalation that is now into and close to the end of the second week. I wanted to ask you, one, to discuss what your findings and your reporting on this pretty monumental event. And also, if you could tie this into something that I've been very concerned about, and I think the rest of the world is, including Russia, is how this escalation kind of marks another step forward to an unthinkable conflict, direct conflict between NATO and Russia.
Yeah. Well, from the beginning, many of us independents, we had two key questions. Was the Ministry of Defense in Russia caught napping in an astounding way? Or was this more or less engineered or re-engineered to set up a lethal trap for Ukraine? So these were my first thoughts from the beginning. Then I started talking to some people, and then I asked some of my very good sources in Moscow directly. Said, look, I know you cannot be compromised. I know this is extremely sensitive matter of national security in Russia, but as much as you can tell me in one sentence or so, more than appreciated. And they volunteered. And in fact, one of them told me that he will give me a full briefing when I'm back in Moscow. I'll be back in Moscow in a week or so. So I'm eagerly expecting this full briefing in detail. It's a very, very, very complicated affair because it involves what goes on inside the Ministry of Defense. They are clans, it's tribal, they are in shock. There are people who are against Belousov, the new Minister of Defense. There's the Shoigu gang, the Gerasimov faithfuls. It's very complicated. And for all of us, it brings back what Prigozhin was saying all the time. And he was, to a larger extent, correct when he was talking about internal corruption in the Ministry of Defense. Of course, this happens everywhere. In the Pentagon, is in fact intergalactic internal corruption. In the German Ministry of Defense, it's the same thing. We don't know about what happens inside China because it's too opaque. And in Russia, as far as we can tell, and as far as intel sources who have their moles inside the Ministry of Defense can tell, it's a very, very complicated affair. We all know there is a sort of purge going on, like Putin feels now with this new government that he's free to finally reorganize things internally in the Ministry of Defense. A lot of generals and all of the old guard have been directly accused of corruption. Shoigu, we can say very, very diplomatically that he was sort of kicked upstairs. And then, of course, there's Gerasimov. Gerasimov is, let's put it this way, a first-class old-school general, but maybe not so good when it comes to fighting this new hot war the way it is developing in Novorossiya and now in Kursk. For instance, a lot of these, I would say, hawkish intel factions, some inside the Ministry of Defense and some interconnected, they think that the Chief of General Staff should be General Surovikin, General Armageddon Surovikin, which he's the guy who basically coordinated that legendary three-tier Russian defense in Novorossiya. Well, according to what I heard, it's really, really complicated inside, and there is no definitive smoking gun. There are reports, internal reports confirmed by intel sources that key reorganization of certain brigades and commanders before the Kursk invasion. Don't forget that the Russians have excellent, not only internal sources and moles in Bankova, in Kiev, but several, let's say, strata of the Ukrainian forces, but also first-class electronic surveillance and aerial surveillance of everything that happens in Ukraine. So obviously they saw a movement of troops near the Kursk border. They knew what this would entail, and that's the point where they made that fateful decision. Should we let it happen? And then we're going to immediately reorganize the whole battlefield scenario according to our own aims. For that, we still don't have a smoking gun, but this looks like the privileged scenario. They were not caught completely unprepared. It's absolutely impossible, considering the level of information that they have on everything that happens in the military and in the intel services in Ukraine. So I would say that this medium to long term, after the Kursk problem is solved, would necessitate a serious internal inquiry and a serious investigation in the Ministry of Defense. Will that happen? We don't know. What we do know is that Belousov is on a mission to finish off with corruption inside the Ministry of Defense. So heads will roll. We still don't know which heads and for what, but that's inevitable. And the fact that there are serious factions inside the Ministry of Defense that are anti-Belousov also tells us a lot, right? So in a nutshell, an extremely sensitive national security matter for Russia. For the moment, they turned it around, and we can say that Putin's decisions let's say in the first 48 hours after they identified what was going on in Kursk, turned the whole thing around because it installed in practice a counter-terrorist operation. In fact, what's going on in Kursk now is a counter-terrorist operation, a take no prisoners ethos, where if you don't surrender peacefully, which is the case of many Ukrainians for the past few days, you are going to be eliminated, and that's it. Take no prisoners. So the choice is yours. And of course, Russia will prevail, and it's going to take time. It's a very, very complicated. It will imply battles for villages and